Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission, as always, is to take these complex stacks of research and really boil them down for you fast. Today, we're tackling that huge question: how do you achieve peak human performance? But maybe not how you expect. We're kind of setting aside the usual self-help stuff to the philosophy.
Yeah, our sources basically argue that focusing on things like, willpower or grit. It's a bit like trying to debug code by shouting at your monitor. It doesn't really get to the root cause. We're aiming deeper, straight into the actual architecture of the brain, the verifiable stuff. The goal here is to give you a shortcut, to understand the real, repeatable mechanism behind high performance, moving past metaphors that feel good but maybe don't deliver consistent results, and getting closer to biological reality.
And that biological reality, that's really the core thesis we're digging into today. The argument pretty bold, actually. It's that neurobiology offers a much more reliable, more predictable way to understand and even train human performance compared to, say, traditional philosophy or even a lot of psychology.
More reliable and predictable. Yeah. It's a fundamental shift. Think of it as moving from an abstract painting of an engine to the actual engineering blueprint.
Okay, let's unpack that straight away,
Yeah.
because that is a big claim. You're saying centuries of thinking about, the human condition might be less useful. What's the real difference between what a philosopher tells you about resilience versus what a neurobiologist does?
Right. Well, it's fundamentally about mechanism versus metaphor. That's the key distinction. Traditional fields, philosophy, psychology, even literature, they give us fantastic metaphors, really useful ways to frame things, to understand motivation through stories or guide behavior. They describe the experience.
Like reading Marcus Aurelius on resilience, the inner citadel idea. That resonates, gives you a concept.
Exactly. It gives you context, a narrative. But neurobiology tries to bypass the narrative and find the verifiable mechanism. So instead of the metaphor of resilience, we look at the actual physical stuff, how stress hormones like cortisol interact with the prefrontal cortex, how dopamine release works when you anticipate something good. We're looking at the hardware, the physical processes that are, predictable.
I can see how that's powerful for training. Like telling myself, be resilient is kind of vague.
Uh-huh.
But if I understand resilience involves, say, inhibitory control in my prefrontal cortex, and the ways to actually strengthen that specific function, well, that feels more like engineering, or like a skill I can build.
Precisely. It becomes a technical problem to solve, not just an aspiration.
Okay, but here's my question then. If we lean so hard into the biology, the mechanism, aren't we losing something valuable from psychology? Psychology focuses a lot on individual experience, personality, the feeling of grit or determination. Doesn't that subjective stuff matter?
That's a really important point, and it actually highlights why the sources argue for the neurobiological approach. It's about predictability and universality. When you rely heavily on psychology, especially personality-based approaches, you run into this huge variability between individuals. It's like trying to write one software patch that works on millions of completely customized operating systems. It's incredibly difficult.
Okay.
But the fascinating thing is the underlying neural machinery. It's remarkably similar across our species. We all share the same basic brain architecture, the same neurochemicals, more or less.
So the neurobiology is looking for the common code.
Exactly. It's searching for that shared biological foundation underneath all the individual personality differences. This allows for developing training methods that are less about whether you're an introvert or extrovert and more focused on optimizing these universal neural systems we all have for things like attention or learning speed.
Right. So you're training the blueprint, not just the paint job. If that's the case, we need to understand how we even got access to that blueprint. How did scientists go from basically guessing to actually observing the brain in action? Because this is where it gets really interesting, isn't it? How did neurobiology get this advantage? It wasn't that long ago. The brain was pretty much a black box. We need to talk about the tools, the tech that let us finally see inside.
Absolutely. That shift is almost entirely down to breakthroughs in neurotechnology. Tools that let us watch the brain work non-invasively while it's actually doing things. Our sources really highlight two main players here: fMRI, that's functional magnetic resonance imaging, and EEG, which is electroencephalography.
fMRI and EG, okay.
And it's useful to know they show us different things, complementary things. fMRI is great for seeing where activity is happening. It tracks blood flow, which indicates energy use in different brain regions. So spatial information.
Geography of thought, kind of?
Sort of, yeah. Whereas EEG tells us when things are firing. It measures the brain's electrical activity directly, so it gives us really precise timing. It shows how quickly and how synchronously different areas are communicating. Temporal dynamics.
Okay, so one gives us the where, the map, and the other gives us the when, the rhythm, and timing. So scientists aren't just looking at static pictures anymore. They're watching the brain live as it tries to solve a problem or like come up with a creative idea.
Exactly. They're watching the system in action. And this ability, watching the whole system work together, led to a really critical insight that changed everything. It overturned older ideas about how the brain works, which is crucial for understanding performance.
What was that older idea?
The older models were very localized, like this specific spot does memory, that spot over there handles attention.
Yeah.
Very compartmentalized.
Like dedicated hardware for each function.
Right. But what fMRI and EEG showed pretty conclusively is that complex functions, especially anything related to high performance, don't happen in just one spot.
Yeah.
They happen across vast, interconnected functional networks.
Functional networks. Okay, explain that.
Think of it less like upgrading just your computer CPU. It's more like optimizing the connections between the CPU, the RAM, the graphics card, making sure the data flows quickly and smoothly between all the parts needed for a task. Performance isn't about just one brain area being strong. It's about how well multiple distributed areas coordinate and communicate within a network for a specific goal. It's about the quality of the connections and the timing.
That really reframes how you'd approach training, doesn't it? It's not about getting better at memory in isolation. It's about optimizing the network that supports memory recall.
Precisely. You're optimizing the system dynamics.
Okay, so following that logic, once scientists could observe these networks, these efficient collaborations in the brain, what do they actually see? What's the biological pattern, the mechanism that defines successful, repeatable performance? If we ditch the metaphors, what's the neurobiological definition of performing well?
Well, observing these functional networks operating efficiently led to a surprisingly simple yet profound definition. The sources define peak performance as essentially aligning with one's biology.
Aligning with one's biology. Okay, that sounds a bit abstract, almost philosophical again.
Yeah, it sounds a bit zen, maybe. But in this context, it's very concrete. It implies that when we struggle, when performance fails, it's often because we're trying to force our brain's networks to operate in a way that goes against their inherent design, their optimal operating principles that we can now observe.
So you're basically fighting your own brain's physics, trying to make it do something it's not wired to do efficiently.
Exactly. You're working against the grain of your own neural hardware. And the path to fixing that, to achieving consistent high performance, it isn't about chasing some vague feeling of success or flow. Instead, it's about focusing on optimizing the specific underlying biological systems that drive all our cognitive abilities. You tune up the core machinery. That's the real payoff of moving from metaphor to mechanism. You get specific targets.
Right. So if we want to optimize, where do we focus? What are these core biological systems we should be targeting?
Based on observing which functional networks are most critical for high cognitive output, the research points clearly towards 4 fundamental systems. These seem to underpin almost everything we'd call performance.
Okay, what are they?
They are motivation, learning, creativity, and flow. Those are the big 4. Those are the levers you can actually pull to improve cognitive performance reliably.
Okay, motivation, learning, creativity, flow. Let's spend a moment on these because this sounds like the practical toolkit. We need to understand why these are seen as biological systems here, not just psychological concepts we talk about. Let's start with motivation. How is that biological?
Okay, motivation. Fundamentally, it's the brain's drive system, its ignition switch. In this neurobiological view, we're not just talking about wanting something vaguely. We're talking specifically about the dopamine reward pathway.
Dopamine.
Yeah. Optimizing motivation means ensuring that dopamine signaling is efficient, getting the brain to accurately predict rewards, and then generate the energy and focus to go after them. If the system is out of whack, maybe dopamine release is too low, or the timing is off, you get things like procrastination, fatigue, lack of drive, no matter how much willpower you try to mentally force.
So it's about tuning that specific chemical pathway.
Okay.
What about learning? We think of learning in school, but biologically.
Learning is pure biological change. It is neuroplasticity. That's the actual physical process of strengthening or weakening connections between neurons, the synapses. This happens based on activity. Neurons that fire together, wire together, as they say.
Right.
So when we talk about optimizing learning biologically, we mean creating the ideal conditions for those connections to form quickly, strongly, and reliably. This involves things we know affect plasticity, like getting enough sleep, using spaced repetition, maintaining focused attention during the learning task. It's literally about rewiring the network physically.
Okay, physical rewiring, that makes sense. That leaves creativity and flow. These often get described in almost mystical terms, but here they're mechanisms too. What's the biology of creativity?
Creativity is really interesting. Biologically, it seems heavily linked to the interplay between different brain networks, especially involving a bit of suppression. Often, generating genuinely novel ideas involves temporarily dialing down the activity in parts of the prefrontal cortex, or PFC.
The PFC. That's
Yeah.
like the brain's CEO,
Yeah.
the logical part.
Yeah, it handles planning, judgment, filtering. It's our internal editor. By quieting it down slightly, you allow other networks, particularly the default mode network, DMN, which is involved in mind wandering, daydreaming, and making loose associations, to kind of run a bit wilder.
So less filtering allows for weirder connections.
Exactly. The DMN can then generate more unfiltered, novel combinations of ideas. Optimizing creativity from this perspective is partly about learning to manage that prefrontal inhibition, letting go of control at the right moments to allow new possibilities to surface.
That makes a lot of sense. Sometimes you have to stop trying so hard to be creative.
Yeah.
Okay, and finally, flow. That feeling of being totally absorbed, time just disappears. What's the mechanism there?
Flow is maybe the ultimate example of performance through biological alignment. Neurobiologically, it's strongly associated with a state called transient hypofrontality.
Hypofrontality.
Mhm.
Less front. So again, dialing down the PFC.
Yes, again, a temporary downregulation of parts of the PFC. But it's a specific kind. It's not about being spaced out. It's about maximizing efficiency and focus on the task at hand. In flow, the brain seems to allocate resources so perfectly to the challenge that it stops wasting energy on things like self-consciousness, planning the next step, or monitoring time. Your sense of self kind of recedes.
Wow.
It's the brain's functional networks operating in perfect synchrony and efficiency for that specific activity. It really is the epitome of aligning task demands with your biological capacity.
That really ties it all together. So we started this journey by suggesting we move away from these abstract metaphors like grit and willpower,
Right.
and instead focus on verifiable universal biological mechanisms. We saw how tools like fMRI and EEG let us observe these mechanisms, revealing the importance of those interconnected functional networks. And now we land on a concrete strategy. Instead of vague advice, we have 4 specific trainable biological systems: motivation, learning, creativity, and flow.
Hi.
Optimizing these systems based on their actual mechanics is the path to peak performance, according to this view. It feels like a much more direct route, a genuine shortcut to understanding the architecture of how we achieve things.
And it's that potential for repeatable results based on mechanism, not just luck or mood, that's so powerful. Which leads to a final thought, really, for you, the listener. Given that neurobiology points to these 4 systems, motivation, learning, creativity, flow, as the direct levers for optimization, what does it actually mean for you to start consciously training these systems? Not just thinking about them as concepts, but understanding their biological underpinnings and working with that biology, rather than just hoping peak performance shows up randomly or, following advice that doesn't account for your actual neural hardware. That shifting focus from abstract wishing to concrete biological training, that's the real challenge and the opportunity this science offers us.